So, welcome C3. Thanks for joining us here in person, or for those of you jumping online. If you're happening to be online, just like Pete the Wild Man wildly said, be sure to click that share button. It's a great way for folks to interact with the C3 online broadcasts. And it seems like we, as a culture, we tend to be doing more and more things online. And one of the things that I was kind of a late bloomer to, my kids got to introduce me to, is this new online art form known as the meme. It's not really new, it's not super new, but it was new for me. And if you're not familiar with what a meme is, shame on you, because they're hilarious. You should get to know some quality memes. But basically, they take an interesting photograph and then caption it with something which, maybe the individual had never conceived of in that moment, but they're meant to be funny, and they're short, and they're easy to understand, and they've been very popular in our culture. So popular that there's actually genres, if I can use such a sophisticated word, with memes. There's meme genres. Now, one of my favorite meme motifs is a series of photographs that simply have the caption, "You had one job." And I'd like to share my joy with some of those with you with some examples here. So here we go. Some "you had one job" memes. So here's a one that I've seen a couple different times. Now, if you're here this morning and you think this paint job looks good, you definitely want to call a designated driver. Your Super Bowl pregame has started way too early. You had one job. Okay, so that's one. Here's another one. So back in my day, we were a lot tougher as kids. So it took me a while to figure out what was going on with this one. So that's here. Now they're going to get more complicated, so you have to wake up here a little bit. So here's one. Got to think through these one because, you're not. If you're thinking you're going to get ketchup, you're not going to be loving it, because those, if you can read those, that's not mustard at the end. That is the wrong color for that. And then just one more here. This one you're definitely going to have to think through here for a minute. I'll give you a second here, but now if you're dyslexic, I have no hope for you. This might look perfectly fine. And, the common thread in all of these is that, we find it amusing that, when you just have, one specific function, one thing to do, you wouldn't forget that one particular thing. It would be almost impossible, we would think, for those things to get mixed up or backwards. And yet, today in my message, I want to talk to you about a very simple instruction that Jesus gives in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, that I feel as a church, not necessarily this church, but the church in general, has gotten mixed up and maybe even reversed, and in so doing, we've forgotten our one job, or at least the one job Jesus talks about here in this passage. And so I want us to examine this and really examine ourselves and see how we might have forgotten our one job and maybe even reversed what Jesus was meaning to explain in this very simple instruction. For those of you who don't know, or maybe this is your first Sunday, we're continuing a series today called Inverted, Reversing Common Expectations. And in that series, we're looking at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and looking at how he turns things upside down from what was popular or even thought of as religiously popular in his day. And he gives an instruction to his followers that really changes their whole view about spirituality and God. And it begins with this amazing truth that through Jesus, the presence and power of God Almighty has come all the way down and is available right now, that the kingdom of God is here through Jesus, and that through faith in him, we can enter into this relationship with God, which brings with it all the benefits and blessings that we might think were reserved for someday eventually. All those things can be present in our lives today. And this is a revolutionary thought in Jesus' day, and I think also in today as well. And so in my message today, we're going to take a look at how Jesus continues to reverse expectations. And he does so by talking about two very common household items, salt and light. And he uses these very common household elements in order to change our way about thinking about how we're supposed to relate to the world all around us. And that reversal that he's hoping to accomplish through his illustration is going to be summarized in today's big idea. So today's big idea that I think Jesus is trying to get to us is that in life, it is not about you. Through faith in Jesus and the entrance into the kingdom that he's offering each one of us, the end goal of him giving it to us all right now is to help us become a people where it is not about you. And if you don't know already, this is one of our C3 values, and I think it's important for us to remind ourselves of what some of these key values are, because we all have a tendency to not live this way, to live like life is really about us. I would even dare to say that it's instinctual within us to craft our lives in a way where it is all about us in sometimes more subtle and more overt ways. But Jesus comes to reverse the way that the kingdom of this world goes, how everything just naturally runs, by introducing us to something that's far greater and far more powerful. So let's take a moment here. We're going to look at Jesus' instruction, and because I want to reverse our understanding of this passage, we're going to have to dive into the text and kind of tear through it a little bit for a while in order for me to explain where I'm coming from. So just bear with me as we kind of go line by line here and try to understand what Jesus originally meant to say in a verse that undoubtedly you've probably heard several times before, and maybe you think you know what it means. Let's find out, shall we? Matthew chapter 5, verse 13 through 16. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's good for nothing but to get thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." Now, they didn't salt sidewalks back then, so that's not necessarily a good thing. "You are the light of the world. A city that's set up on a hill can't be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket. They put it on a lampstand so that it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." And there it is, very short. A little short section. Let's go through it kind of bit by bit here and see how our expectations of what we think this passage might be gets reversed. So let's begin. Jesus starts off by saying, "You are the salt of the earth." Now, if you've been in Bible studies or maybe heard this preached before, typically what happens at this juncture is you'll hear a bunch of the different uses for salt in the first century. And unfortunately, none of them have to do with salting sidewalks. So, sorry, that's probably what we would think would be the typical use. But there's like 4 or 5, uses that, preachers or Bible commentators will go into, and there's all kinds of different ones. I mean, in the first century, salt was a pretty handy thing to have around. I mean, it was used for as antiseptic. It was used actually as currency. Roman soldiers could get paid in salt. It was used obviously as flavoring. You could use it for that. It could even be used as a soil additive in certain situations. And then, of course, it could be used to preserve meat or food products. And so typically, you'll get a big list of all these possible meanings, and they'll land on one, and then that'll be the sermon that gets preached, that we need to be some kind of preservative, out there in the world. But I just always questioned myself, is it fair for us to lay out 5 different possible uses, and a lot of them are really quite different, and then we get to decide what it is, and then we move on from there? Wouldn't it be more fair to Jesus to look at what he talks about in the whole passage, and let's see if he kind of guides our understanding of what it means to be salt? And so let's look a little bit later on at what he says in the following verse. He not only says that we're salt, but he also says, you're the light of the world. Okay, that seems like a similar thought, right? And then what does Jesus do? He puts in the clutch and he downshifts and changes his metaphors, which, my English teacher would not approve of, but he's Jesus. He gets to do what he wants. So he's talking about light, and then he talks about cities. But what is Jesus' point about talking about the city? It's simple. Don't overcomplicate it. He's basically saying, things that are put up high are easy to see. That's all he's trying to communicate. A city up on a hill is pretty obvious to see. How do we know that's what he's saying? Because then he follows up in the very next verse by saying, lights typically go up on high things, lamp stands, right? So if you have, floor lamps in your house, typically they have a stand. Why do they do that? Well, because lights cast better light when they're up high. And so Jesus' point here, I think, makes very clear sense that household lights, this is going to bring us back to our main idea, household lights exist for those who are in the house. Those lights exist for the people in the house, right? You can't be selfish. You wouldn't light an oil lamp and stick a basket over top of it. I'm actually pretty sure Jesus is being a little bit funny there, because an oil lamp covered by a basket is a definite fire hazard. You don't want to do that. But the image is just ridiculous. Nobody lights a light and then keeps it to themselves, unless he's drawing kind of an image about how we can tend to live our lives. Lights exist for those in the house. So if we look at this little statement about salt, and I'm going to land the plane here, over top of the other statement about lights in the world, I think Jesus is making a far simpler statement here than whether salt's an antiseptic or a flavoring or a preservative agent. He's just using that little word "of" to draw a very straightforward, life-reversing conclusion that if we're going to be his followers, and if we're going to be the salt, and we're going to be the light, then we exist for others. You're the world's salt. You're the world's light. That we can't live for ourselves anymore. We've been welcomed into this kingdom. We've been offered this free gift of grace through his life, death, and resurrection. We've been forgiven and set free so that we might use that freedom for others. And we have this bond and responsibility to the earth and the world, all over the people all around us, that we cannot neglect or run away from. It's our one job. So why, you might ask, and I want to tie this in, why would Jesus have to warn us about this danger about us withdrawing from the world. And again, I just love that Jesus' sermon on the Mount is one complete message, and we can't read it in bits and parts. So why does Jesus warn us about this? Because he knows that as his church goes out, they're going to be persecuted. They're not going to be received with applause. And so that persecution, like he mentions in verse 10, Matthew 5:10, is going to cause them to withdraw. So right before Jesus talks about being the world's salt and being the world's light, he says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sakes. The kingdom is yours." And he reminds us that this gift of his grace is absolutely ours. And that as we move out into culture, things may become difficult for us. And pain instinctually is something that we withdraw from. You know, you stick your hand on a hot stove and your hand immediately comes back to you. And that's the way we are designed. And I'm not saying we should necessarily burn our hands off. Jesus is going to go into some different stipulations about, you know, how we can exist in a culture that's contrary to us later on in the Sermon on the Mount. So stick to that. But he knows what our automatic response is going to be. That his church is going to go out and our tendency is going to be to circle the wagons, to huddle up in these places and complain about the world and talk down on those who don't receive us and make our lives all about us in this place and forget what our mission and calling and why we've received this amazing gift of grace, why we've received it. And we'll just hide ourselves. Some of you may be familiar with a German pastor by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a famous Christian pastor when the Nazis had taken over in Germany. And what kind of set him apart? A lot of things, his writings, but also his willingness to stand up to what was happening all around him, because the Nazi regime had come alongside the German church at that day and really kind of linked arms with them and were using the church for its own political advantage. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw this and stood up against it. And that's a danger for every generation, not just in that day, that people would want to hijack the church and use them for their political means. So he stood up against that, even though it was unpopular in that day. And because of it, he was arrested, placed in a concentration camp, and eventually he was killed for his belief. But he had, I think, an amazing quote and insight into this danger of the church hiding itself. And this is what he said very forcefully. He says, "A community of Jesus which seeks to hide itself has ceased to follow him." That Jesus is always going on his mission, if you can pick up his drift. Jesus is always out there engaging with the world. And so the moment that we pull back from that, we have stopped following him. And that's what we have to ask ourselves. You know, have I isolated myself from the world, from the people of the world, for those who have different viewpoints or perspectives than me? How much insulating have I done in my life? And maybe even feel good about it in some way, instead of faithfully moving out into the world, facing difficulty, and in the midst of those hardships, learning to lean further and deeper into the gift of the kingdom that Jesus has offered me, so that I can find the strength and power that I need to live out in a way for others. And I can't necessarily tell you exactly where that line is for you, or your family. But I will tell you this, that if Jesus looks at his followers and says, hey, you're the earth's salt. Are you listening? You're the world's light. Jesus is issuing a challenge that all of us need to come face to face with, because he knows that our tendency is to pull back. And so each of us have to stand before the words of Jesus in this passage and be pushed a little bit farther, because our natural way is always going to make it all about us. And so Jesus warns his church about the dangers of withdrawing, but he also, in this passage, gives a little bit of instruction on how we're to live for the world. Now, I want to go back and take a look. This is Matthew 5:16, and it says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." Now, one more nerdy thing here, okay? So that word "so," some of your translations may not have that way, but this is the way I grew up hearing this verse. Sometimes, and this is a problem with the English language, we think that Jesus is using the word "so" here like we use the word "very." Let your life, so shine, right? Or like, very, 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 like we would use it that way. But that's not what this word is. It's more like how sometimes in our culture we use that word "thus" and "so," or we might use the word "so" to describe the manner in which something is to be done. In this way would be a better translation of that little word that Jesus is using there. And this is his point. I think his point is to say that we're to live we're going to be the world's life, and I want you to shine your light in this way. Because there's a lot of ways that we can shine our light. We can walk around like we got a mag light. We're shining in people's faces. We're like we're interrogating them, where all the light is on them, and we don't have to. We're not being exposed by any of it. We can shine our light like an interrogator's lamp, or like a spotlight from a helicopter hovering over the world, where it's all about pointing out what's wrong with them. We can go into our world not really like salt, but we can go out there being really salty towards other people. Or we can heed what Jesus says here, which is, in this manner, I want you to go out into the world, good works. And let me define that a little bit further. You're going to go and do things that the world is going to see, and they're going to thank your Father in heaven for them. They're not going to walk away from you thinking, what an obnoxious, privileged Christian. Wow, that was really someone who was loudmouthed and rude. They're going to see what you're doing as a good thing from their perspective, a helpful thing, and thank you for it. You're going to be salt, not salty towards them. And just so you don't think I'm out on a limb here, another famous pastor, John Stott, really smart guy. If you don't know his name, just know this guy's really smart. That's all you have to know. He was commenting on this passage with his smartness, and this is what he said. He said, the primary meaning of works from this passage must be practical, visible deeds of compassion. It is when people see these practical, visible deeds of compassion that they will glorify God, for they embody the good news of his love, which we proclaim. Practical, visible deeds of compassion. Which means that we need to be a people who, as we march out into the world, refuse to grow in resentment and anger, refuse to want to get back at people. We're going to be folks who bring the up there kingdom down here by turning the other cheek, by offering to others who would take from us, who go the second mile even when they don't have to. So much of the Sermon on the Mount, when we understand it based off of this verse, makes way more sense. Why does Jesus call us to be this kind of people? Because this is the very temptation that we'll have to not turn the cheek, to become all about us, to circle the wagons, to shut the world out. But we don't have to be those kind of people. Jesus has already stated that through his death on the cross, he's bringing everything about the kingdom down to us in the here now. Notice how he ends verse 16 here. He says they're going to see what you're doing and they're going to glorify your Father. He's yours. There's no conditionality here. He is yours 100%. You're in the kingdom. He's watching over you. He's taking care of you. And this has nothing to do with what you're going to do. It is because of your faith in what Jesus has done. This isn't a kingdom that you earn or that you have to appease God in order to stay into it. He wants to be a father. He wants to treat you like his children. And what does Jesus say about fathers and children later on in the Sermon on the Mount? He says, come on, to his first followers, you know that parents know how to give good gifts to their kids. Trust your Father to do that as well. And he reminds them that he's always looking out for them, that a hair on their head can't fall to the ground without God knowing it and counting it, that he's got their back. And so they can live radically different lives for the world, so secure in Christ that no matter what's taken away from them, their lives still feel full because they've been blessed by him. And so they can walk out into the world living radically different lives that reflect God's character to the world. One last verse here from the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, I think, echoing back to this passage, says later on in Matthew 5:44 and 45, he says, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you. I think that word ties us back to what we were thinking here. So that you may be sons and daughters of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good. He's indiscriminate in his practical, visible deeds of compassion towards the world. Sound impossible? It really is. Doing this verse in your own strength, an absolute waste of time. Jesus isn't just interested in people who can smile no matter how much it hurts inside. He's not looking for fakers. He's not looking for folks who have all the right religious veneer but have none of the heart that needs to come behind it. If we're going to live this Sermon on the Mount, we need to have our hearts and lives turned inside out. That's what his whole Sermon on the Mount is about. That's why it's called inverted, reversing our expectations. We need to face who we truly are and come face to face with what Jesus is offering here in the Sermon on the Mount, that the kingdom is ours, that no one can take this away, that we can be the lights of the world because Jesus came as the light of the world. He was living for others. That's what he did. And through that, he was killed. And then through his death, he offers to us a position and a gift of a kingdom that will never fade or go away. And we can live as his church following him, following the Jesus who, while he was hanging on the cross, looked at the folks with the hammer in their hand and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And that's the offer that he gives to us. And he's offering it to you right now. One final note about this passage, the one thing I didn't get to mention is that in this verse, the word you should be underlined. Jesus uses an extra word in this passage to highlight the fact that you are the salt. You are the light. And you might be looking around like, me? Yeah. Like, we're just those messy people, right? That we talked about last week. I don't have my life figured out. I don't think I'm, some kind of beacon of hope to the world. And that's exactly the people that Jesus is looking at and exactly the people he is inviting to do this work, because when it's us, messed up people who actually get it done, they're going to look at you and say, I don't know where that came from. I better praise your Father in heaven. They're going to look at you doing these incredible things through the power of Jesus, and they're going to say, clearly, this is not coming from them. And they'll see your good works. They're not going to praise you, but they'll praise your Father in heaven. So how can we go and do that? A couple of suggestions for next steps. One kind of a learning step and one more of a practical step. The first step, the learning step, and I know throughout this series we're encouraging you to get in and go through the Sermon on the Mount, but here's, it's so rich, it's worth reading with different glasses on each time. Here's the set of lenses I want you to wear as you read through some of these passages in the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew 21 to 48 is some of Jesus' main teaching in chapter 5. But as you read them, and you've probably heard them before, ask yourself the question, how does this life that's being described here describe a life that's not about me? And then as you read that, take a moment and just thank Jesus that he can set you free from a life that's all about you and to live like the way he's describing in these verses. So for instance, I think one of Jesus' first teachings, he says something like, you've heard it said before, don't murder, but I say don't even be angry. And if you were to read through that passage and think, how much of my anger exists because I think it's all about me? My agendas, my things, my. How much of that comes out of the sense of being empty and alone and helpless as opposed to living as a son and daughter in the kingdom, which is already yours, and just living out of the joy of that? So take some time, read through that. The second one, more of a practical step. We've actually highlighted this step before. It's one of those C3 habits we would love to see all of us trying to do regularly. Bless 3 people this week, 2 of which are not a part of C3. We love blessing each other, but what if we were to go out as the salt of the earth, as the light of the world, and just blessed people this week, help them to see the practical, visible, good deeds of compassion, and allow that to be our light that shines. It's natural. It is natural to live for ourselves. Nobody said that this Christianity thing would be easy. A lot of us are living for ourselves. We're living for our comfort, our prestige, our security, our wealth, our good religious image. And we need to recognize that it's not just a world's problem out there. This totally has worked its way into the church. And we've come up with tons of religious ways of justifying our behavior. One last quote, it won't be on the screen, but that talks about Christianity that has kind of made it all about us. This is from N.T. Wright. I heard this earlier this week, and he says, all too often Christianity is looking for a form of our faith where God is required to command what we already love, and God is required to promise what we already desire. How much of that describes us? But Jesus has come to turn everything upside down, to teach us a way to live where it's not about us anymore. He's come all the way down to introduce us to a kingdom which is absolutely available here, right now. And through his death on our behalf, he welcomes us into the family, not partially, but all the way in so that we can live differently. And so he offers this to us and says, this is what the kingdom's for. Take it. But as you take it, remember, you're the earth's salt. But if you forget your one job, what use do you have? You just get thrown out and trampled by the persecutions that will come. You're the world's light. When you put something up, it's way easier to see. That's why you have lampstands in your home. So lift your life up so that others might see your good works and thank the Father in heaven. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the challenge to change the way that we think about our life, that it's no longer ours, that it belongs to you, and that in your hands it is in the safest place in the world. We ask that you would help us to step forward into this kingdom, to believe that you have us so well protected, so well provided for, that we can live radically different lives, not for ourselves, but for those around us, just as your son, Jesus, lived for us. And so we pray it in his name.